Welcome. I have Dan Hotchkiss with us today. He is the author of Governance in Ministry, and he has come out with a new edition of Governance in Ministry. And he's agreed to talk to us today to share a little bit about the differences in the book. And I read the new version as well as the old version, and there are quite a lot of differences. So I can't wait to hear you talk about them. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me, Renee.
This is great. So I want to ask you first I understand you really don't like the term policy governance.
So, I don't dislike it, but I don't use it.
You don't use it?
For a couple of reasons. One is that policy governance really belongs to the John Carver model of nonprofit governance, which is different from my thinking in many ways. In the UUA, the term policy-based governance or governance by policy are often used as a way of honoring Carver's ownership of the term policy governance while at the same time distinguishing what people are doing in UU churches. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't use those terms either, and the reason for that is that they put more emphasis than I would put on the board's policymaking activity. One of the problems that I find I run into regularly is that, excuse me, the people who are most enthusiastic about governance change, which is the term that I use, are often people who really enjoy tinkering with policy language. And the board gets the idea that their life ever after is going to consist mostly of writing policy. And that is actually a fair characterization, I think, of some parts of Carver's approach. But it's not what I'm aiming for. I look for a board that governs in a variety of ways. In the new edition, I talk about governance by partnership, governance by conversation, and governance by policy as three balanced pieces of governance.
Great. So with this new edition, you've added a lot of new sections and things. What did you learn between when you wrote the first book and when you started writing this one?
Well, the big thing I learned was what it would be like for a congregation after it reads the first book. Nobody knew about that, including me. So what I've tried to do in the second edition is to provide answers to the kinds of questions that I've been dealing with in almost 10 years since the first edition came out, and to provide more helpful resources for congregations that are persuaded by the general vision of governance that's set out in chapters 3, 4, and 5, but would like more help getting through that policy writing process and restructuring process to the point where they can live a new and more rich and mission-driven life as a board staff partnership.
So what are some of the new sections that you're talking about?
Well, there's a section called Life After Governance Change where I describe where we're headed. People often ask that. They like the notion of a board that spends more of its time thinking about big long-term questions, a board where board members have a better experience and feel that their time is better used than board members often do. And so I try to cast a vision in that chapter. I also have a chapter about congregation size, which is a great big question. People say, well, this doesn't really apply. And there's some truth in that at least the way that governance concepts apply is going to be different in congregations of different sizes. And then I also created, against some of my own ambivalence, I created a model set of policies. People ask for that. People get that, for example, from Carver. And I resisted that because I think that congregations should not simply adopt a boilerplate set of policies. Instead, they should work through the major issues themselves and create their own model rather than borrowing a model from somewhere else. So what I did was to create in my own mind and imagination an imaginary congregation and write some policies for them. And the first thing I say up front is how proud they are that they have these policies instead of ones that they might have borrowed from a book.
That makes a lot of sense. So people have something they can look at, but really you're encouraging them to start from scratch, sort of like marriage vows, right?
Sort of like that, yeah. I think it's a similar sort of balance. There are some mistakes in both realms that have been made before, and it's worth telling people about those. But unless people launder the ideas and the questions through their own brains and in their own relationship with one another, it doesn't mean as much. And of course, what often happens is that people do a good job of getting things on paper and then never look at it again or don't really live by it.
It makes sense. So you talked a little bit about congregation size. How does your model differ in differing sizes of congregations?
Well, what people have observed over and over again is that this seems to be for larger congregations, and that's because clear governance thinking is most clearly enacted or most literally enacted in large congregations, because large congregations live more by their formal agreements about how to live. So in other words, bylaws, what office you hold, what agreements you have about how you're going to make decisions, those actually describe a bigger percentage of the behavior in a large, complicated organization than in a small, simple one. In a small congregation, you have more the kind of tribal behavior that happens among people whenever they gather, informal sorts of arrangements, such as what used to be called matriarchs and patriarchs. I use the term parents in the new edition to talk about the fact that there are some people, actually in congregations of every size, but most importantly in small congregations, who have earned the trust of the congregation to the point where they need to be consulted about pretty much everything. And it's very foolish in a congregation that's small to act as though the bylaws tell you who has power, or that whoever happens to be on the board right now collectively have authority, or that being the pastor or the minister counts for anything at all until you've built up some trust. It does actually in large congregations count for at least something, but in small congregations it counts for either nothing or less than nothing, depending on the congregation. So that's a little sense of really the sliding scale between large congregations and small. I have new diagrams where I've reworked some of the familiar size category literature from the Alban Institute into my own governance and ministry-oriented set of questions.
Yeah, I found that really helpful when I was looking at those diagrams, because congregational size really does make a difference, and we're really finding that, especially for small congregations, we really have to, almost have some different materials that we offer as resources. So I appreciated those.
Yep.
So imagine I'm a congregational leader. What are some signs that maybe we're ready for a governance change? What should I be looking for?
Well, probably the biggest motivator that I see starting out is unhappy board members. Board members in all kinds of organizations are less happy than their leaders think. And so if you actually ask board members, how do you feel about board meetings? How do you feel about the work of the board over a year? Most of the time, you need to brace yourself for some more negative responses than you expect, and that's actually a good thing in the sense that that's a good way of gathering some will to move ahead and explore how you might do things differently. Other things which are more warning signs about when it's not time to do a major governance change process. Number one, I wouldn't do it when there's more than a medium level of conflict, because governance change, just like strategic planning or a ministerial search or any number of other major things, if there's high level of conflict going into it, people will look at the process as a way of getting an advantage in the conflict that already exists. And so generally speaking, what I would do would be to If the conflict is more than what we call level 3, where people are starting to choose sides or meet separately, that kind of thing, I would address that first before talking about governance change, because there's a risk that not only will the governance change fail, but you'll spoil the idea of governance change for another generation of leaders. They'll never want
Oh,
to go there again.
that's a really good point.
Finally, and this is something I emphasize more strongly in the second edition than I did in the first, I wouldn't do governance change, generally speaking, in the first 3 years or so of a new ministry.
Mm.
The agenda in that time needs to be relationship building. I think it can be a good idea during an interim to rethink governance arrangements so that when you make your relationship with a new minister, you can do that based on an honest disclosure of what the role is. I think after the third year oftentimes is a very good time, assuming that the first 3 years have gone reasonably well, to rethink, once there's a level of trust, how you're going to work forward in the future. But generally speaking, I could be persuaded of exceptions, and I have been. But generally speaking, I would avoid those first 3 years.
That makes sense. So, would another time maybe be when a congregation's hitting a growth plateau?
And that would be a time to do it, perhaps. I think there are several reasons why growth plateaus happen, and I talk about that a lot in the chapter about congregation size. But one of the reasons that congregations plateau is that they reach a size where their way of making decisions doesn't work anymore, and it becomes more and more necessary as you get larger to be willing to be decisive as a congregation and to be mission driven. And the old ways of trying to keep people happy or quiet really get in the way of the congregation succeeding at what it's there to do. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes deliberate, well-designed governance change can be a way of helping to overcome a size transition.
It makes a lot of sense. So as a congregational leader, what might be the first steps that we would want to take if we're considering governance change?
Well, number one, you should buy many copies of my book. Even just owning them, putting them under your pillow has been known to work wonders. Secondly, it can be sometimes helpful to read it as well. Third, I would have some conversation about it at some point. There's no particular order to do these things, but collecting some sense of what the motivation is. Why is this coming up? If the reason you're talking about governance change is that one person read the book and got excited about it, or went to one of my workshops and got excited about it, that's not a good enough reason. I warn people at workshops about that all the time, especially if they come alone. I try to encourage people to come in teams because there's always a risk that they'll be persuaded of something. And then to have some kind of an event where the material in chapters 3 to 5 gets presented. One way to do that is to have me come and do it, which I love to do with congregations, either as part of a larger consultation or by itself. Or sometimes groups, a team or an individual will develop a presentation themselves. And the important part of that is not so much the presentation, but the conversation, the getting people together to think about what makes sense, what seems easy, what might be harder or would be more against the culture, which is sometimes a reason not to do something. Sometimes it's a reason to do something. If you recognize that some of your cultural ways of doing things in the group have been a problem over and over again, those might be a priority to change. But that's a conversation for each leadership group to have separately. There's no one formula for that, although I try to lay out much more than in the first edition how I have worked with congregations since in the 10 years or so that I've been doing it since the first edition came out.
Mm-hmm. You know, as a pragmatist myself, that's one of the things I really like about the model. It's kind of a generational thing sometimes. They say that the Gen Xers tend to be more pragmatic and like get her done kind an attitude or a posture in the world. which I like about it. So I'm noticing that a lot of the congregations who have younger leaders have been coming to me and asking about governance change. I'm wondering if you've experienced that at all.
I would say that it's been delightful to me to be connected with a wider range of generational groups among leaders. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd say it's also been delightful for me that I've had a chance to work with so many different faith groups. I've worked now with 30 different denominational families, and everybody has a different take on it. With UUs, it's all about do we want to do this or Carver? We're alone in that. Nobody else thinks about that in churches that the churches that know about John Carver are in Canada mostly, or Australia. I've had people at my workshops, or Mennonites know about Carver. Largely, so they became interested in my book partly out of that. So it's interesting, it's of course just fascinating to work with different groups, because having grown up as a UU and worked as a UU minister for so many years, I share many of our cultural assumptions about what's impossible or what's possible, and getting out and around is a great way to explode some of those.
That's great. So for our final question, I'd like to ask, what's your elevator speech about the difference between governance and ministry, since that's the title of the book?
It is. It is. Well, governance is owning the place in behalf of the mission. I believe that just as stockholders are the owners of a business corporation, and the board's job is to act for the stockholders in the interest of the stockholders, the job of the board of a congregation is to act in the interest not of the members, but of the mission. The mission is the owner, or is like an owner for any nonprofit organization, I'd say. And when members vote, they too have a duty to vote what the mission calls for, rather than what they personally prefer. So that's governance, and that'd be the congregation's role as governors-in-chief in our tradition, and the board's role as their agent in governance. Ministry is also something that involves everybody. Incidentally, governance is not just the board as distinct from the minister. I think the minister should almost always be at the board table and participating, whether they vote or not. But the ministry side is making things happen in accord not just with the mission, but with the priorities and goals that the board and the head of staff have agreed upon after much conversation with the whole congregation, with the rest of the staff. So there's a point of setting what I call a vision of ministry, which is the 3 big goals for the year, is one way to frame that, and making that happen. That's ministry, the way I use the term in the book.
That's great. So you recommend that congregations and ministers work together to set yearly goals?
I do, yes. I want the board to be involved in that, and to make the final decision blessing a set of goals, very high level goals. And I give actual examples, walking through a table of year 1, year 2 for my imaginary church. And this, incidentally, is I think one of the ways that many congregations go wrong trying to change governance, is the idea that the board should only operate at such a high, lofty level, and that the staff should make all decisions about how to achieve those lofty goals, including what the annual goals are. That pushes them too far apart, in my view. I think that's not realistic. I think it makes it very difficult for the board to exercise meaningful oversight, or for the staff to be accountable, because it's so difficult to tell whether you're doing what needs to be done to best achieve those lofty goals. Whereas if you agree on some priorities for a year, it's much easier to tell whether you're making progress, and to look at the question of why you are and why you're not.
That makes sense. So I know we talked a little bit about staff being accountable to goals, but what about volunteer steps, like volunteer ministry? Um, how does that?
In the book, when I use the term staff, I mean everybody who's doing ministry.
Okay.
That's a little bit of a hump conceptually for people. There are some congregations, by the way, that use that term, at least in some areas. The RE staff, for example, often is what people mean by that is meant to include volunteers such as teachers. And I think that it's important that while there are differences, of course, between people who are paid and people who are not, one thing that they should have in common is being part of a unified ministry organization that works through differences so that they can be moving in the same direction. Churches too often put volunteers in charge of pieces of the church program as if it were a good thing for them to be completely out on their own. That leaves them unsupported, and it also leaves the church fragmented. Mm-hmm. so that it can accomplish less than it could if the leaders of ministry worked together, not to be all marching lockstep, but to be committed to common goals and to working together and supporting each other to achieve those.
Right. We talk a lot about alignment in the work that I do, that we want
Yes.
all the ministries to be in alignment with one another. And I like the metaphor of a sack, like a three-legged sack race where you're heading toward a goal and you're constantly adjusting with your ministry partners as you go toward it. You know, it's not perfect. There's, one person's not necessarily leading. You're sort of going together and adjusting accordingly.
I like that too. Mobilizing Congregations by John Wimberly is an excellent guide to the piece of the governance change process that belongs to the ministry organization, which is to transform what in many congregations are a group of committees that theoretically report to the board into teams that are part of a ministry organization together. And John is one of my colleagues in the Congregational Consulting Group and before that at the Alban Institute. And so I'm very familiar with his approach, and he's very familiar with mine. And our intention is to make the books good companions for anybody who wants to do the overall process of change. I'll add also that Susan Beaumont, who's also a member of that group, has written and does great workshops about staff leadership and how to do supervision and accountability within the staff. That's also very much consistent with my approach.
That's great. So it's helpful that each one of you comes at the whole organization at different angles in a way that really knits together nicely.
Yes, wonderful folks. The Congregational Consulting Group. We've hung together for a reason.
Right. So spend just a minute talking a little bit about committee versus team versus maybe the board versus the congregation as a whole in meeting.
Okay.
What should happen?
Well, say the question again.
So I think there's different decisions happen in different areas of the congregation. So
right.
team members can make some decisions on their own.
Right.
Committees
yes.
make some decision, or have some purpose. The board has a purpose, and then the congregation as a whole makes certain decisions, like calling a minister and
right.
things like
that.
So,
good. Yes. Yeah, what I'd say is that the congregation, a typical congregant, doesn't have to think too much about these distinctions. They will volunteer as part of the ministry of the church, and they'll also go to a congregational meeting where they're taking part in making some of the highest level governance decisions, and may not need to be all that versed in what the difference is. It's the leaders who set the agenda for those different kinds of congregational participation who need to know this best. So, but briefly, the congregation in our tradition elects the board, and for the board to do a good job of articulating high-level purpose for the congregation, interpreting what the mission calls for this year to do, they need to be in conversation all the time with the congregation. So one of the techniques that I describe in the book is what I call open questions, where the board, in addition to coming up with those 3 top goals every year, they also come up with 3 top questions that they want to think about in the course of the year that might very well shape their decisions about goals a year hence. And that's a great way of getting the congregation to engage in thinking with the board about the future, so that when the board makes decisions, it can do it boldly without people being quite so shocked or saying, nobody asked me. Now, a couple of things. Number one, when I say the congregation, I mean those who are willing to engage in that kind of conversation. In my experience, in almost every congregation, that's 80 to 100, meaning if it's an 80-person congregation, it's everybody. But if it's larger than that, it's apt to be somewhere from 80 to 100 who will really engage with one another seriously in that conversation. It's the number who come to congregational meetings in almost any size congregation. And the congregation at meetings, voting on things, it's very difficult to make that a meaningful exercise in democracy. Now, calling a minister is one place, but even there, the table has been set. A committee has been working for a year or 2 sometimes. And so it's not as though the congregation is originating that decision. They're blessing it, which is important. But what really makes it work is the preparation that you do. So committees help the board to govern. So the work product of a committee should always go to its parent. Most committees, that'll be the board. A few times, that'll be the congregation. For example, a ministerial search committee in our tradition is conceptually, in my view, really a congregational committee because its recommendation goes there. Teams are accountable to their supervisors. So within the staff structure, if you imagine a large church, it might be a multi-level structure. In a small church, it'll be simpler. And some supervisors will be unpaid. But every team is accountable to somebody, and that person is responsible for making sure they have what they need to do their job, and to make sure that they stay aligned, as you use the term, that they're helping to achieve the goals that the congregation, through its board and head of staff, have agreed are the goals.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any other questions or any other things that you want to say that we haven't talked about?
Oh, so many things, Renee. Maybe we should talk again.
Yeah.
But I'm just looking forward to being in conversation with people for another 10 years about the new version of the book, and I look forward to hearing from anybody who would like to do that.
Great, wonderful. Well, thanks again for your time, and yeah, the contact information for Dan will be available in the information section of this video if you want to get a hold of him. So thank you.
Very good.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Renee. Bye-bye.
Bye.